I'm making a bowl for my Husky. I start by weighing out 1.5 kilos of clay and wedging it. This makes sure the clay is combined fully and there aren't any air bubbles. Air bubbles can explode in the kiln. I'm securing the clay to the bat and beginning centering. This is where you make sure the clay isn't wobbling off to one side. The larger the amount of clay you're centering, the harder it can be, and you have to do it in sections. To center the clay, you cone it up and then push it back down again. This helps to align the clay particles. After centering, the clay should no longer wobble and I can begin throwing. I'm firming the clay down to make sure there's a nice level top before I open out the centre. Because the bowl I'm making is quite large, I'm flattening the clay down quite a bit before I start to open it out. He has decided to join me for this voiceover, so if you hear extra breathing, that would be him. Now I'm opening out the form with my fingertips, gradually pulling the walls out to the side. I'm using a ruler, although it doesn't really look like a ruler anymore, it's covered in clay, but just checking the diameter of the bowl to make sure it's the right size for him. I also need to account for the fact that clay will shrink with firing, so I need to throw the bowl larger than I need it to be when it's finished, as it will shrink. Now I'm pulling up the walls of the bowl with my fingertips and keeping my hands in contact with each other. This helps to keep my hands balanced and steady. I'm pinching from the inside and the outside, trying not to pinch too hard because you want the pull up to be even all the way, so you don't end up with a thin patch in your walls, which can collapse. Now I'm using a soft rubber kidney to help compress the clay in the base of the bowl. This is to help stop the clay from cracking. I'm using a very sharp metal tool to carve away a bevel in the base of the pot. Using a thin metal kidney held to the outside of the bowl but not quite touching, I use my fingertips inside the bowl to gently push the walls out to meet the kidney. This helps to straighten the walls and at the same time removes the wet slip from the outside to help the pot dry more quickly. Using a soft piece of wet chamois leather or a piece of plastic, I'll smooth over the top edge of the bowl. This helps to compress the clay and make the rim strong. I leave the bowl on the bat, I don't try and cut it off, as I've had issues with the wire cutting up through the bowl and basically cutting it in half. So I leave it on the bat to dry. This is a resin paw print that I made from Kirsch, my Husky, quite a while ago now. And I'm using it to form a plaster mould that I can push clay into to make a replica of his paw print. I have the tiniest knife. I'm securing the resin to a flower pot base because it was small enough to use as a mould form. I'm using a very tiny knife to smooth out the clay around the edges to get a nice mould to work from. I then build up a wall with some more clay so that the plaster doesn't run out. You need to make sure there's no gaps that plaster can escape through, so I attach a sausage of clay into the gap between the wall and the base. I'm using a mould release on the resin. I don't know how well it will come out of the plaster without a mould release. The clay doesn't need mould release because it's already a material that won't stick to plaster. I use a bin bag in a bucket. This helps with cleanup. And pour in the amount of water that I think I will need for the plaster mould. It's basically a guess. I don't really measure it. Wearing a face mask because you don't want to inhale plaster dust. I then pour the plaster into the water, and I go with the technique that I was taught during my degree, which is to pour the plaster in until it starts to form an island in the middle, and then you know you've got enough plaster for the amount of water that's in the bucket. about it. It's starting to form an island that takes a few seconds to dissolve. Then very gently with the back of my hand I swirl the plaster to mix it. You don't want to add bubbles into the plaster, so this is the best way to mix, so you don't take your hand in and out. After much mixing you can see that the plaster is starting to thicken and is starting to warm up as well, so now I know it's ready to pour. I'm trying to pour in one place so that I don't introduce bubbles into the mix. Jiggling the mould will help to bring bubbles to the surface and off of your mould. It doesn't take long for the plaster to set. Due to plaster contamination, I have to keep this clay separate from the clay I use for making pots, because any plaster that goes inside the kiln is likely to explode. So I have to keep this clay in a bag and only use it for making plaster moulds. It's always exciting when you take the mould out and see whether it's worked or not. It came out so easily. It's a good idea to clean up the edges, as you might have thin pieces of plaster that could break off and end up in your finished pieces, which would not be a good idea. So I use this cheese grater type tool, I'm not sure what it's actually called. It shaves off the corners and makes them nice and smooth. Now it's time to make a paw print. I'm flattening out a piece of clay and I'm just going to push that into the mould. I smooth it down with a rubber kidney, making it as thin as possible. I don't want it to be too thick, as it will add thickness to the base of the bowl. Thickness in clay can be a bad thing, it can explode. There's a lot of exploding in this. And it also will take longer to dry. And when you have different thicknesses of clay drying in one piece, it can lead to cracking, as the different thicknesses dry at different rates. Now I need to make a slip in order to attach the paw print to the leather hard dog bowl. This just involves using the same body of clay mixed with some water. I'm using a scraping tool to smush the clay together. I'm now using the same tool to scratch away a patch on the bowl where the paw print is going to go, and I'll do the same to the paw print. This gives the smooth clay tooth that the slip can join to. I add slip to both the paw print and to the bowl to make sure I get a nice strong join. I'm using a rubber kidney to gently ease the paw print off the mould. You don't want to use metal tools on plaster because it can scrape away pieces of plaster and contaminate your clay. So I just use a rubber kidney. I can then position the paw print in the centre of the bowl. I make sure I do this with the sides lifted up so that I'm not trapping air bubbles underneath. I wiggle the centre until it sticks, and then very gently I'll press outwards from the centre, pushing the clay down onto the bowl. This is to avoid trapping air bubbles, so I go gradually around from the centre to the outside. Then once I'm happy there aren't any trapped air bubbles, I can use my fingertips and tools to smooth out the rough edges of the paw print so that it blends in nicely with the bowl. This sometimes results in pieces coming away, but that's fine. So long as there is a nice strong join all the way around, then it should be fine. The key to success with this, as I have had some failures, is making sure that the dog bowl is not too much drier than the clay you're attaching. So at this point the bowl is coming up to leather hard. It is still attached to the bat, so it hasn't dried out enough to release from the bat. So it's still fairly wet and at a good stage for attaching the paw print. If the paw print is too much wetter than the body of the bowl, then there's a chance during the drying process they'll dry at different rates and the paw print will crack or pop off. I did actually have one this happened to. I'm using a wet paintbrush to help smooth out the rough edges around where I've just attached the paw print. It's been a few days, the pot has been drying, it popped off the bat on its own, so I didn't need to cut it off, and now it's time to trim the base. I'm using a loop tool to first of all carve a bevel in the bottom of the bowl, and then using the point of it I carve away 2 foot rings in the base. I do 2 because it's quite a wide bowl, and if you only have 1 foot ring on the outside, there's the potential for the bowl to sag in the middle. I've carved out the centre foot ring and now I'm carving out the outer ring. I use the corner of the loop tool to do the carving. It also has a rake on one side, so I can turn it over and use the rake. This has less resistance than using the full flat edge of the loop tool, so it makes it a little bit easier to carve away. As you get to the outside of the bowl, it's spinning faster than at the centre, so sometimes it's easier to slow the wheel down a little bit. Once I'm happy with the depth of the foot rings, I can then use the flat edge of the loop tool to smooth it out. I then use metal tools like this ball stylus and the back of a small spoon to smooth the clay and burnish it. The underside of the bowl will have no glaze, so I want it to be nice and smooth. I have a metal stamp with my logo, which you might have seen on my artwork. It's a heart in the shape of my initials, JB. I press it into the clay and wiggle it up and down and left and right to get a good impression. It's had a bisque fire to 1000 degrees. This is my first attempt at a soap dispenser. This is a flower pot I made for a plant that my sister gave to me. And here is the dog bowl. And the paw print is still attached. It hasn't cracked off like the one before it. The clay I've used for this bowl is called Lava Fleck, and at bisque temperature it comes out looking pink. Using a damp sponge, I clean away any dust that could prevent the glaze from sticking properly. I'm using Terracolour's Ice Flower, as I love the way this one flows. It takes any glaze on a vertical surface with it as it flows down. I apply 3 coats of ice flour on the edges of the inside of the bowl. I don't do it on the top or on the outside, as I know it will run. You have to wait for each layer of glaze to dry out before applying another layer. The base of the bowl has 1 coat of ice flour and then 2 coats of Snow by Amico. This is because ice flour, although it looks pretty and glossy when it runs down the sides, at the temperature I fire, it doesn't go as smooth on a flat surface. So I use Amico Snow instead and apply 2 coats over the top of the ice flour. I'm using a pencil and my whirler to add a line to the bowl on the outside so I can see where to stop my glaze. As I love the texture of this clay, I want some of it to be visible when it's in use. I follow my pencil line to get as smooth a line as I can and apply 2 coats of iron luster to the outside of the bowl. And then apply 2 coats of iron luster to the inside. I don't need to be as accurate this time though, because I know the glaze will run down the inside of the bowl. Iron luster doesn't flow on its own, so on the outside of the bowl I know it will maintain that perfect line that I got. Over the top of my 2 layers of iron luster, I applied 2 coats of blue rutile. Again, on the outside I tried to be as accurate as possible because the blue rutile won't flow, so it will keep whatever line I make. On the inside I know it's going to flow over the ice flower, so I don't need to be too accurate. The colours of these glazes will look very different when they're fired. You can see there's a dribble on the inside of the iron luster. I'm not worried about it because you won't even see that once it's finished. The kiln has been fired to 1200 degrees Celsius, and this is what the bowl looks like. You can already see how much the ice flour has flowed down the inside and taken the iron luster and the blue rutile down with it. And it's so good! You gonna go sit down for your lunch? Okay. If you love our dog bowls as much as I do, and you would like to buy one, we do actually have 2 available. They are glazed slightly differently to the one in the video. One is purple and one is blue, and the glaze on the inside is a matte speckled sea salt glaze. But they both still have a paw print on the inside made with Key's paw. We also have 2 other dog bowls available, neither have a paw print in them. One is white and red, and the other has a potpourri glaze. It's got tones of reds, purples, blues and yellows, and almost looks like gold on the inside. They're all listed with their sizes and capacity, so you can judge whether or not it'll be big enough for your dog. You can see the dog bowls, more of my ceramics and merchandise, and Key's plushies on our website designedbyvoo.com. There'll be a link in the description. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Hope you found this interesting and maybe you felt inspired to have a go at pottery yourself. And if you'd love to see Key's reaction to getting his new bowl when I first showed it to him, there'll be a video on his channel tomorrow. Like the video if you did, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and we'll see you in the next video.